Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Bukowski. I'm an AI content ops architect at IBM. My role is kind of unique. I look for ways to use AI to improve our content related processes and tools and our external content user experience. What I want to talk about today is the changing nature of our role as content professionals in the era of RAG and agentic solutions. First, I'm going to quickly review what RAG and AI agents are, and then I want to focus in on the role that content plays in the success of those solutions. Then I want to take a step back and talk about the implications of this for our content strategy, and look also at how we as content professionals can improve the results of these solutions by focusing on improving the content in the knowledge base. What do I mean when I say RAG and agentic solutions? In a retrieval augmented generation solution, when user input comes in, let's say it's a question. It doesn't have to be a question. There's lots of different patterns, but let's imagine it's a question answering use case. So the question comes in from the external user, and then what happens next is the solution will search in a knowledge base, for example, product documentation, for relevant articles, and then the solution will create a prompt that has the article text right in it, as well as an instruction to answer the user question, and then the user questions pulled in too. And then that's sent to a large language model to generate output that answers the question. To make this real and a little bit more fun, imagine that we have invented a new writing device called the Carbon Write 9000. Okay, it's a pencil. It has a light for writing in the dark, and it has a battery that, to make the light work, and there's a voice interface so that you could configure the battery. Now, because we just invented the Carbon Write 9000, no data that was used for pre-training any large language models could possibly have mentioned the Carbon Write 9000. So any large language model that exists today, Carbon Write 9000 would not be in its vocabulary, and there would be no weights in the model to handle any questions or anything to do with Carbon Write 9000. So if you were to ask a large language model, prompt a large language model with a question answering kind of prompt, what kind of thing is the Carbon Write 9000? No model is going to get that right. What you can see here is the prompt lab in watsonx.ai. That's IBM's foundation model platform. You can see my text in black, that's my prompt, and then the highlighted text in blue is what the large language model generated when I clicked the generate button. You can see the answer's wrong. But if I was to paste some of the Carbon Write 9000 documentation into the prompt, in like the pattern that I showed a minute ago, now you can see my text says article, and then there's the article, my pretend article, and then there's the instruction, answer the following question using information only in the article, and then the question again. Now you can see the highlighted text in blue that was generated by the large language model is correct. Sometimes you'll see people call this grounding. They'll say this prompt is grounded in the article. You'll also see this referred to as in-context learning. This is what makes RAG solutions work. Let's look at AI agents now. Similar pattern. I'm going to show two different examples because there's hundreds of ways to build AI agents, but let's imagine that, remember I said that the Carbon Write 9000 has a voice interface, so let's imagine that a user said out loud, I wish the battery lasted longer. Under the covers, your AI agent might search the Carbon Write 9000 documentation and might compose the prompt on the right-hand side there that pulls in API reference information this time. If we prompt a large language model, the large language model could generate the syntax for the command that we would want to call to configure the battery so that it lasts longer. So the AI agent would take that and then, execute that on the command line or whatever. Here's another way that you could build an agent. This way does things in like baby steps. So same input, I wish the battery lasted longer, and then your agent application logic will do some searching for relevant information just like before, but the prompt might be broken up into sort of logical steps. So first, is there a command? Is it a system command or REST API? And what is the syntax? And at the end, we still get a command that the application would call to actually carry out the task. And just to show that I'm not lying, that this really works this way, here is the prompt lab in watsonx.ai again. And you can see I've got the prompt from the previous slide. There's the instructions, and then there's the piece from the API reference. And then you can see where I type, is there a command or REST API? When I click generate, yes is what the generated output was. And then I kept that there as part of my prompt. And then I appended, is it a system command or REST API? And then I clicked generate again. And the blue text system command is what was generated. And then I appended, what is the command to call with parameters? And battery config longevity is what was generated. So this is more like a chat back and forth or ongoing thing where the previous output is saved as part of the prompt for the future prompts. The point here is that I'm not making this up. You pull in reference information in this case, and that's how the large language model can figure out how to generate the output that you want. So probably you can guess what the role of content is in these solutions. And that is crucially important. Without accurate, up-to-date, domain-specific content pulled into those prompts, the RAG solutions, the agentic solutions cannot work. And where does that content come from? Us, writers. We've all heard about how writers are going to be using generative AI to help streamline our processes and help us get more writing done in less time and so on. But at the end of the day, the large language models don't know what they don't know. You need a human curating this content and making sure that the way it's structured and the way it's written will make these solutions successful. So let's look at that next. How do we need to adapt our content strategy so that this new use of our content will be successful? The first example that I would give is the idea of optimizing knowledge-based content for these RAG and agentic solutions. And basically what that means is doing experiments to see what kind of structure in the documents makes these RAG and agentic solutions more successful. Search optimization is more important than ever. In that first step, if the RAG solution cannot find the relevant articles, then the whole thing fails right there. So things have to be optimized for search. And we'll talk a little bit more about search later on. Also, all of these points here list examples of things that our team has discovered through trial and error and experimenting that affect how successful a large language model can be at generating a good answer for a given question. And I'd point you to a Medium blog post by my teammate, Inga Halilovic, because she has laid this all out and has talked about the kinds of things that you can do in your content to make RAG solutions and agentic solutions, find the relevant articles, and then generate good output. Something else to consider is a technique called question-driven content design. In a nutshell, what this means is going out and collecting real user questions. These are questions that real humans have asked in their own words. That's really important. If you just guess, if you just make up your own questions, your familiarity with your product and your content is likely to bias the way you phrase the questions. So go out, collect real user questions, then use a large language model to generate questions answered by your content, then compare the generated questions with the real questions. When they match, that's a good sign that a RAG solution or an agentic solution using that content as its knowledge base would be able to answer that question. And if there are user questions that have no matches, that's a sign that there might be a gap in the content or the way the content is written is such that the large language models can't successfully extract the related facts. I did a deep dive in this technique. There's a link there to a GitHub repo that dives deep into this. To give you a taste, let me show a demonstration. Did you know that in Vienna, Austria, there is an orchestra famous for making their instruments out of vegetables? Here's their Wikipedia page. It's quite nice. But does this Wikipedia article answer the questions people most frequently ask? We can test it to find out. First, we need to collect some questions that real people have asked about the vegetable orchestra before. Luckily, the orchestra members themselves have collected a very nice frequently asked questions webpage. Also, when lots of people submit similar questions as a query to Google search, Google collects those and shows them when you make similar queries too. Here's a web tool we can use to test whether that Wikipedia article answers those questions. You can see I've pasted the questions on the left and I've pasted the Wikipedia article on the right. Now I'm going to click Test Content. Okay, the results are in. The tool has used a large language model to generate all questions answered by the Wikipedia article. Then the tool compared the generated questions to the real user questions. In this table, you can see how well they match. In the first column are the real user questions. In the second column are the generated questions that most closely match those user questions. And then there's a similarity score. Here we're using a similarity threshold of 75 out of a score of 100. So anytime the match is 75 or better, we're going to assume that that means the generated question matches the user question. And from that, we can infer that a RAG solution using this content as its knowledge base could answer that real user question. Let's double check that the 75 threshold is the right number. Yeah, you can see when the score is less than 75, the questions definitely don't match. But when the score is above 75, the match looks pretty good. So, as it stands, this tool is suggesting that 34% of those real user questions can be answered by the Wikipedia article in its current form. Let's scroll down to see if there are some themes in the unmatched questions. It looks like there's a lot of unmatched questions about the vegetable instruments themselves, about making those instruments. So let's update the article to include more information about making those instruments. Great. Now let's test that updated article to see how well it performs. Success! Adding that information has improved results to 52%. Another aspect of content strategy is related to publishing or the availability of content. Consider the following 5 levels of RAG and agentic readiness. Level 1, no value. A business or an institution or organization cannot get value from a level 1 content source through its use in RAG or agentic solutions. Attributes of a level 1 content source include that most members of the organization cannot get access to the content, or the process for requesting access is onerous. Maybe there's no way to download the content in bulk or access it programmatically, or you have to ask somebody to get it for you. Maybe the content is difficult to navigate. Maybe the content has not been cleaned of personal information or confidential details. Maybe the format of the content is difficult to process, MP4 files or PDFs or unwieldy HTML files. For level 1 content sources, even setting up demonstrations or proof of concept RAG solutions and agentic solutions is not containable. Level 2, some value. An organization will not get long-term benefit from RAG and agentic solutions using level 2 content as their knowledge source because the maintenance of keeping those solutions current isn't sustainable. Attributes of level 2 content would be that most members of the organization can get access to the content, and there is a basic method for downloading or copying it, maybe like a web page where you click a button and you can download it in bulk or something like that. With level 2 RAG and agentic readiness content, members of the organization could build RAG and agentic demonstrations, but they would have to constantly be manually downloading that content and having to build their own search component. So that's going to make maintaining these things very difficult. Level 3, medium RAG and agentic value. An organization can benefit from RAG and agentic solutions that are using level 3 content sources, but the cost of maintaining those solutions will be high enough that the solutions get abandoned. Attributes of level 3 content sources might be that there is a straightforward and transparent process for getting access to the content, members of the organization to access the content. The content might be cleaned of personally identifiable information and other kinds of sensitive information. And level 3 content probably has some kind of API to more easily get at that content. Level 3 readiness probably would also have processes for getting help with troubleshooting problems with authorization and using the content. Members of the organization who are building RAG and agentic solutions with level 3 readiness content still need to build their own search component, but that can be automated. So that does make it faster and easier to build demonstrations, and you might even be able to move some of these solutions into production. Level 4, high RAG and agentic solution value. An organization will get high value from content that is at level 4 readiness because it's easily incorporated into RAG and agentic solutions that increase productivity and reduce customer support costs. Attributes of level 4 readiness content might be that getting authorization is automated and almost instantaneous, There's a search API and a content API that RAG and agentic solution builders can just use, and the content is always up to date. It's being maintained. Another attribute of level 4 readiness would be that there is a good process for getting help when there's some content missing, or there's a problem with the search or content APIs, or some of the content needs to be updated. With level 4 readiness content, members of the organization building RAG and agentic solutions can stand up demonstrations and POCs in an afternoon, and they can move these solutions to production in a matter of days. The search API, in this case, would make it straightforward to add this content source to a hybrid search component for a multi-agent or a more complex RAG or agentic solution. And level 5 RAG and agentic readiness would mean you are winning at RAG, winning at RAG and agentic solutions. So if you have content that is at level 5 readiness, that means your organization will gain an industry advantage because this content is so easy to use in RAG and agentic solutions. Also, a level 5 content source might even be itself a source of revenue. So if you're a business, maybe this is an example of content as a service. Maybe you have customers paying to access your content for their RAG and agentic solutions. Attributes of a level 5 readiness source of content would include that the people who own that content prioritize RAG and agentic readiness and are proactive about working with people in the organization and outside the organization who are using that content for RAG and agentic solutions. Level 5 content sources might have search and content APIs that are supercharged for RAG and agentic use cases. Like maybe you can put a parameter on the call so that you get the content back in different formats that are desirable. Also, level 5 content sources might have a community of users who can share their projects and share lessons learned. Level 5 content might have ownership, lineage, and update history available programmatically for governance of these RAG and agentic solutions. With level 5 content sources, RAG and agentic solution builders inside the organization and outside users can effectively troubleshoot and fix problems, collaborate on solutions, and build infrastructure to support orchestrating complex RAG and agentic solutions. In the past, content strategy might have meant anticipating how readers will view your content in books or PDFs or on HTML web pages. Now, our content strategy also has to make people who are using this content in RAG and agentic solutions successful. Now let's talk about how to evaluate and improve the results of these RAG and agentic solutions. When it comes to evaluating results, there's manual approaches and automated approaches. You can see here a picture of a little web app that our team created to streamline the task of reviewing answers returned by RAG solutions. You can see the user question on the left, the generated question in the middle, and then on the right-hand side, we can evaluate the effectiveness of the answer according to different criteria. So we might first ask ourselves, is this a valid question? In other words, is this a question that we should be able to answer? If so, we ask ourselves whether the input was classified correctly. Our RAG solutions classify the type of question, because then we have different kinds of prompts and we handle it differently. So we double check whether the question's been classified correctly. Then we ask ourselves, does an article exist to answer this question? If so, did search find it? If so, when we sent the assembled prompt off to the large language model, was the model able to generate a useful answer? So we can go through that pretty quickly. If you do that once a week, it doesn't take very much time. And do you ever get good data after not very long? Having a couple thousand examples of questions and answers that are right or wrong, you can use that in good ways. You can also automate some of this evaluation. So, for example, there are techniques that compare the relevance of the search results to the input question. There are techniques for comparing the faithfulness of the generated answer to the relevant article. And there are techniques for comparing the relevance of the generated answer to the input question. Those techniques aren't perfect, and I would caution you against trying to rely on them 100%, but they do have a place and they can streamline part of this task. Our team wrote a paper, and as part of that exercise, we took one of the common benchmarks that researchers use to evaluate RAG solutions called the Natural Questions Benchmark, and we did an experiment where we implemented a very simple RAG solution. We counted up how many questions our very simple solution was able to get right. Then we rewrote the content a little bit, and then we ran it through our RAG solution again and saw that we were able to get 100% on that subset of that benchmark just by correcting the content. To you as writers, that might not sound like a big deal, but it's really funny how every team that I have seen or worked with or heard about, that we're all sharing our experience with building RAG solutions and agents. So often, the developers who are building the solutions will try to improve results by fine-tuning the embedding model, or choosing a different vector database, or choosing a different large language model, or working on their prompt engineering. Very often, the developers forget about the knowledge base, or they treat it like it's just kind of there, and they forget that you could update the knowledge base. Writers, that's our first question. What should we be doing in the knowledge base to make this more successful? But when you're working with teams who are building RAG solutions, they will very often forget about the content side of things. And so this little experiment was intended to show, hey, look, you can get a perfect score on this benchmark if you just rewrite the content a little bit. Just for a moment, let's take a side trip and talk about that developer bias that I just mentioned a minute ago, because as a content person, you are going to run into this over and over. The term RAG, or Retrieval Augmented Generation, was first used in this particular paper, and everybody keeps referring to this paper when they talk about implementing RAG solutions. Those researchers implemented their search component using a vector database. They break their content into chunks and they put it in a vector database, and that's how they search for relevant articles for given input. And that choice made by those researchers made sense because their knowledge base was Wikipedia. I love Wikipedia. I'm a big fan of Wikipedia, but the content in Wikipedia can sometimes be pretty messy. So the decision to break the content into chunks and then use the vector database, that made sense because their knowledge base was Wikipedia. Because this paper was so influential, everybody just keeps copying that implementation choice. But if you're working on RAG and agentic solutions that have a knowledge base that is, product documentation, content produced by a professional content team, then that choice to use the vector database as the search method is not the right choice. So if you have your content broken into topics already, then you know that for a given subject, there is a topic that has all of the relevant information. It's concise. It doesn't have any extraneous or unrelated information. So why would you break that into chunks? It would be like looking at the information through a keyhole. If a writer has taken the time to create this topic, instead of pulling the chunk into your prompt, you'd want to pull the whole article in. That's something that's called parent document retrieval. As writers, we have so much metadata that can be useful for effective search. And now people are integrating some of those traditional techniques into these RAG solutions and using things like knowledge graphs and so on. So as a writer, when you are working with a team to build a RAG solution or an AI agent, know that by default, they're going to assume that they should break the knowledge base content into chunks and put it into a vector database and throw away all that metadata. As a writer, you need to learn enough about how RAG and agentic solutions work so that you can have a conversation with your team about this choice. Use your experience as a content professional to help them make better choices about how to build their search component. I've got RAG solutions that work great that do not use a vector database at all. Now, I'm not saying that you would never do that. It depends very much on your content. But I'm just saying you are going to see teams who default to using vector databases and nothing else. And it's going to be up to you to broaden their horizons on this point. So after all of that, what is our role in all of this? I've seen some presentations that suggest the role of writers will be reduced to quality assurance teams just checking RAG results, and that's about it. I don't think that's right, because fundamentally, those fancy pants RAG and agentic solutions everybody's so excited about cannot work without the accurate, up-to-date, domain-specific content that writers create pulled into their prompts. The challenge is going to be that a lot of developers and AI researchers might not know that. It might not occur to them. when their results aren't what they had hoped for, they're going to look to see if they can change things in the application logic or in the embedding model or their vector database. And as writers, we have to help them see that having a content strategist curating that knowledge base will make their solution more successful. The challenge is that these solutions are not very difficult to build. So you're going to have a development team who gets something up and running and they feel great because they've hit that milestone. And they're going to be making questions up out of the top of their head. And those questions will probably be a little bit biased. And so probably they will have an inflated opinion of how successful their solution is going to be. And they will launch that solution. And the first 5 users that come in will ask totally unexpected questions. And then they will look at the application logic, they'll look at the embedding model, they'll look at the large language model, they'll look at their prompt engineering, they'll look at their vector database, they'll look at their chunk sizing, they'll look at everything except the content, they'll forget about it. And then, 6 months or a year later, performance will hit a wall, it's just not getting any better. And maybe it will occur to them at that point, maybe we should look at the content. It's up to content folks to initiate this conversation with teams who are thinking of building RAG and agentic solutions. Maybe this is an issue of branding. Maybe we should come up with a different title for what we do or a different way of describing what we do. Maybe we should call it knowledge-based design instead of content design. Maybe that would make you a knowledge-based engineer or a RAG content strategist. I don't know. Maybe if we change the words we use, it'll have a greater impact. If the ideas presented here today interest you, I've got all kinds of blog posts that dive into the details and explore these ideas. I would love to hear from you. What are your thoughts about the role of content professionals in this era of RAG and agentic solutions?